Hello there, good afternoon. It's just after 5 at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, as opposed to 5 o'clock. We all wish, because that would mean the start of the weekend. Before, though, we're going to keep you entertained for the next hour or so. And welcome to a brand new series of Spotlight. A little bit like Spotlight Manchester, where we take either 1, 2, 3 or however many issues and throw them into the spotlight. Now, in the news recently, we've heard quite a lot about euthanasia, assisted suicide, assisting dying. It's given a lot of different terms and names, and actually I wanted to take this opportunity for this programme to simplify the terms and throw around the issues and see what you think as well. Of course, we all know it's against certain religions, but there are many, many issues surrounding it. I have two guests with me this afternoon. Dr. Hans Christian Rabe is a GP from Partington here in Manchester, so good afternoon to you. You're also part of the Maranatha group.
Maranatha, community, which is a Christian group, but we're also very much involved in Parliament. So we've done some, parliamentary submissions and also done a parliamentary consultation on the subject of euthanasia.
Fantastic, and thank you for your time this afternoon. And Carol Haig, Professor Carol Haig, I beg your pardon, from Manchester Metropolitan University. You're a professor in nursing here in the city as well.
That's right.
You've got some very, very strong views as well regarding this subject, and some useful knowledge to bring into the discussion as well. So thank you for your time as well this afternoon. I think we better start with the terminologies for euthanasia. I think most people, we were discussing this beforehand, I think most people have a vision when you say the word euthanasia. I think they have a vision of an old lady in a bed who is incapable and can't care for herself. What do we do there? Would it be in their best interest for them to go on living? But actually it's a lot more complex, Carol, than that, isn't it, in terms of its definition?
It is indeed. For a number of people, euthanasia has a very negative connotation. They tend to associate it with involuntary euthanasia, where people don't have a choice. They tend to associate with genocide and issues like that. For a long time in this country, it was referred to as assisted suicide, which is a slightly cosier term, if you like. But the general feeling now from charities like Dignity in Dying, for example, is the term assisted dying.
Yeah, because it's becoming a lot more complicated in terms of, as you say, it's almost gone from exclusively an issue of other people's decisions, more to a standpoint of choice from the individual, isn't it? It's going much more, it seems to be swerving much more that way.
Absolutely, Derek, you're quite right there. For me, and for a lot of people who take the pro-choice stance that I take, it's all about choice, individual choice, and that will cover people who are opposed to assisted dying and in favour of it.
Hans Christian, very, very difficult subject this, though, isn't there? Because there are morals, there are ethics, there are different religions that come into this as well. It's quite a tangled web, really, isn't it?
Yes, but on the other hand, I think we perhaps need to look at, if you come back to the definition, I mean, obviously Dignity in Dying, as essentially as a pressure group that wants to change the law, would obviously take a perhaps more generally acceptable kind of language. Ultimately, euthanasia is, and if you sorry if this sounds a bit harsh, is basically about killing people, isn't it? Yes, perhaps they might have said yes, they want to be killed, but all the evidence, for example, from Holland, which is the country that has the longest experience with this issue of euthanasia, shows that once you legalize euthanasia, people will die that have not asked to die. This is because there will be like a slippery slope. People will end up being killed even though they haven't asked for. So, for example, some years ago I spoke to a Dutch doctor who was very concerned about the situation in Holland. What he says is that he knew a lady who for religious reasons was opposed to euthanasia. She got ill with cancer. She increasingly felt that she had become a burden to her family, to her husband. She asked for euthanasia, and eventually she was killed. That I think what happens once you legalize euthanasia, people will feel pressurized into agreeing to be killed.
The Dutch were the first to legalise euthanasia in 2002. Aren't there always going to be occasional cases, as there are extremes in any particular field? I mean, we were talking before, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to this. We're not about to solve this in the next 60 minutes, are we? We're talking about a number of factors involved. The fact that in the UK there have been no prosecutions in cases where maybe relatives have gone with their loved ones over to Switzerland to the Dignitas clinic or such things, there have never been any prosecutions in the UK. Doesn't that pave the way to almost allow legislation for this? It's a very, very tiny number of cases, isn't it?
At the moment it is, but like with anything, once you legalize it, the numbers will go up, isn't it? And I think with that then would come, the potential for abuse. Yes, Holland might have legalized euthanasia only in the early 2000s or so, but they've had a practice of over 20 or 30 years where it's gradually been accepted, where perhaps technically it wasn't legal, but essentially it has been done, And I'm actually really worried about what happens in euthanasia in Holland. I mean, you described this example of, for example, the elderly patient with Alzheimer's, who is dying anyway, and then the situation becomes what perhaps should euthanasia be right. But I understand that from Holland that there are cases of young people, for example, a young woman with anorexia, who asked for euthanasia, or people with Crohn's disease ask for euthanasia, or just people who are afraid of physical decline ask for euthanasia, and euthanasia is being carried out.
Carol, sorry to interrupt. Carol, there are legitimate cases here, and we are talking about Christian talking about what we would consider, I think, to be kind of borderline cases, which would almost maybe need to be reviewed on a one-on-one basis. There are, though, plenty of examples that we've seen of late. The young gentleman, the rugby player who was paralysed. Yes, a very, very recent example of the news.
Yes.
He made that choice with a very, very free and open mind, but not even necessarily from a very, very desperate point of view psychologically. Wasn't he just being pragmatic in that case and saying, well, actually, I don't have a future here. I can't do anything about that. That's a physical thing. This is what I want. So
well, I can see the point, but I think actually that is one of the best arguments for some form of protective legislation in this country. If Daniel James had been in a position where he knew this was a legal option, he may not have gone to Switzerland when he did. And there are quite a number of, admittedly anecdotal cases, of people who have gone to Switzerland while they could still go under their own power, because they didn't want to leave their family open to potential prosecution in this country. And Debbie Purdy herself, who was the woman who pushed the legislation and the recent consultation document through last year in around June, has said herself that if it hadn't have been for that, she wouldn't be here now, because she would have gone to Switzerland under her own steam. She's still enjoying her life, she's still living her life, because she's confident that when she needs to do this, at a time of her choosing, she can do that. And if I could just pick up on some points that Hans Christian made about the slippery slope argument, I totally take his point that there will always be anecdotal evidence around this. However, there was some research carried out in 2007 that looked at the details from both Oregon, where they've had assisted dying on the statute books since 1998, I believe, and also from the Netherlands. And they have found that there is absolutely no evidence that vulnerable groups are being pressured. They looked at the elderly, they looked at people with learning disabilities, they looked at people with mental illness. The only people who they found were potentially vulnerable to this were young men with HIV/AIDS. But then that was on data from the late 90s, early 2000s, where AIDS was basically a death sentence, and that blip has now flattened out. So really, the slippery slope argument doesn't stand up when you look at countries that have legislation. And I think the other side to that argument is we have no data for what's happening in this country. We don't know how many people are being helped on their way, and we don't know their thinking. The argument behind legislation is it would protect those people as well.